Good evening. We spent 40 minutes together. I try to be not too much serious because it's a very nice weather. It's a summer evening. We are well off in this place in Strelka on the Moskova banks. So it's, but as you know, sometimes the things that do not look that much serious are the most interesting, in fact. So I'm going to talk about architecture, of course, and I have picked up a theme for you tonight, which is timeless architecture. And I mean by using timeless architecture, the fact that in architecture there are some values that refer to the universal. Over time, some people are still valid, and you do not feel the time that passes over the building. And sometimes you look at the building, which is 40 years old, 50 years old, and it seems like it had been designed yesterday. And so these values, I'm very much interested in analyzing what makes such interesting architecture in timeless dimension. And also, I want to put together this idea of timeless architecture with the idea of modernity and heritage. And as you know, half of the world population is living in cities. Moscow, Paris, London, New York, all the main megapolis in the world now are gathering more than 50% of the world population. In 20 years from now, it will be 75%. It means that 2/3, 3/4 of the world population will live in cities. And so the cities will change deeply, including Moscow, including Paris, including all these big megapolis that change drastically. And if they change, that means that the people want to come back to cities and want to live in the most attractive parts of cities. And the most attractive part of the cities is always the center of the city. And that means that the available housing, available offices, available services for the people in center cities are not sufficient. So the architects are thinking out how to create new buildings in these very touchy places, which include, of course, buildings belonging to the heritage of architecture. And the architects found themselves in this very difficult situation where they have to design modern buildings next to buildings listed in the idea of heritage. And I've done that several times in my life. I have written a book on this issue, Modernity and Heritage. And of course, every time I do that, I design a modern building next to a listed one. It's the scandal starts because the people say, look at that modern building next to this beautiful listed monument. How is it daring putting such a modern piece to a next building? And I think it's a necessity to do that because a city that does not change, a city that does not accept pieces of architecture of today will decline. So this is my subject. And to start with, I would like to send you a message of peace. This is a very nice, you see, I tried to do it. It's not easy, but it's a bird, as you know, the bird of peace, and at the same time an open hand. And this is the hand that Le Corbusier designed just facing the mountains of Himalaya in India, in Chandigarh. At this time, Le Corbusier, that was this theoretician, Swiss theoretician, architect, we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of his death last year. And Le Corbusier, as being this incredible genius of architecture, incredible success in architecture, and some say incredible failure in terms of urban theories. And as he was putting this principle in the 50s, the principle of theory of coming for the Chartre d'Athènes, the Charter of Athens, the Congress of Modern Architecture of the 50s, that are just after the Second World War, he has put a theory where designing the city with a grid system divided in the parties where the people, in the sections where the people should live, the sections where the people should work, and the sections where the people should have leisure. And so this very, let's say, simplistic way of looking at the territory and urban planning has led him to a very sophisticated theory that he has tried to implement for many years. And he has been, of course, at this time, you may remember that in India, the successor of Gandhi, Mr. Nehru, was looking for a way to make himself known throughout the world in using modernity for that. So he called Le Corbusier and he commissioned him to design the plan of the new capital of Punjab, which was the northern state of India, Chandigarh. So Le Corbusier was very flattered, of course, for that, being recognized through his theory and called for designing a new city. So he went to Chandigarh and he started designing the city with this the project. And of course, today, I don't know whether you have been to Chandigarh. Personally, I've done that 2 years ago, and I have worked for you a picture of Chandigarh. So 50, 60 years later, this is what Chandigarh looks like. So the theory has collapsed completely, unfortunately. So you see that the 3 buildings have been built, the Court of Justice, the Parliament, and the Secretary building, but the city does not exist. So this founding theory of the post-war 50s has not been, demonstrating its pertinence in terms of a possible way for creating a path for architecture. In the same time, and on the other part of the world, Mr. Kubicev, this is the Court of Justice in Chandigarh. On the other part of the world, Mr. Kubicev, the president of Brazil, wanted to do the same because he heard that Gandhi was calling on Le Corbusier to create this new city. So he wanted also a famous architect to create the new capital of Brazil. So he called Oscar Niemeyer and Lucio Costa to join together. Oscar Niemeyer was the famous architect you likely know, and Lucio Costa was the famous town planner. And they joined together to design this incredible plan of Brasilia in Brazil. So this was the original plan. And like in Chandigarh, finally, this plan in the early stages of this implementation gave this wonderful setting, wonderful buildings. The assembly, the parliament, the government of Chandigarh, and only one is missing in this picture is the cathedral, because the cathedral was in Brazil, was built also by Oscar Niemeyer. And then, like in Chandigarh, the plan diverted, continue, but in other bases. And if you have been to Brasilia recently, you have seen that this plan has not been also a success, and not either a possible way of going for modern architecture. So in these both cases, these theories of the post-war have demonstrated their inability to create a way for modern architecture. And so Le Corbusier was, dubious, like this, asking himself what to do in the 60s. And you see, it started, you see this picture, he has drawn on a blackboard, he has drawn the section of this famous cité d'habitation in Marseille. You may have heard that last week the UNESCO has announced that 17 buildings by Le Corbusier have been included in the World Heritage. And so this building that you see the section behind as being included in the World Heritage. And so Le Corbusier has failed completely in his urban theories, and he has succeeded wonderfully in his buildings. So that's, I want to start my lecture in trying to state that to you. Also, you will have noticed that this section, because Le Corbusier was in Moscow in 1929, and he had seen a building which is just next on the Moskova River, next to, which was built at the time, next to the American embassy, and the section of this building is this kind of duplex system that you see on this picture, and that Le Corbusier had seen a reutilized in this building. So Moscow has been one of the first inspiration of the work of Le Corbusier. It's interesting to know about it because, you know, of course, each architect is looking at things and taking parts of different elements of different buildings all the time and making its own work by adding, changing, aggregating all these elements to make his own architecture. And it's important to know that Le Corbusier has taken something from your city. And then, of course, the story ended in a very strange way because this is the Voisin, the Plan Voisin in Paris, and you will recognize the city of Paris behind the plan. And he proposed to demolish half of the city of Paris and to rebuild the city by the series of towers that you see in this picture. And of course, again, you see this picture as being completely scandalous and this building as being completely marvelous. Well, so that shows that you can fail in urban theories and you can succeed in architecture per se. He has created also not only a wonderful building in terms of architecture, but he has created also the idea of the vertical city. And then we come to the theme that I have introduced to you at the beginning of my lecture, which is the increasing of the density of city centers. I told you that more and more people want to live in center cities, and of course, the land becomes scarce. The density increases because more and more people come, and less land is available. So the only way to solve that equation is to increase the density. But this is not because you increase the density of a city that the city is better. And sometimes is even worse. Well, if you increase the density of a city, you have to add something else. And this something else, Le Corbusier added it through the mixed use of the building. So in this building, you find housing, you find a school, you find a swimming pool on the roof, you find an hotel inside, you find shops in the street. So this building has become an idea of a vertical city. And then came the final stage of all this story. You know, when there is a major public building to design, politicians, they have to hire an architect. And then comes the difficult question of the choice of the architect. And sometimes they don't know how to choose. And as you know, they are not often very courageous. So instead of choosing one, they choose several. And that's what happened in Paris, you see, for the construction of the UNESCO. So the different heads of states, they were unable to agree on, upon the name of an architect to design this building. So they took all these people. And you find there the most famous architects of the 60s. You find Eero Saarinen from Finland. You find Pietro-Luigi Nervi from Italy, the famous architect engineers. You find Ernesto Nathan Rogers from America. You find Walter Gropius, the founder of the Bauhaus, that then went to Harvard and to Cambridge in the United States. You find Bernard Zorfus, the French architect that designed the famous Knit building in Paris. You find Le Corbusier, of course, that you see there in the picture. Marcel Breuer, the famous American architect. Sven Markelius, from Norway. And so all these architects, they have been commissioned all together to design this building. And of course, as you know, in a group of 7 or 8 architects, not the 8 architects designed together, or one or two, take the lead of the group and start designing. Le Corbusier, of course, take the lead. Marcel Breuer take the lead, the American. And Bernard Zerfus, that was the French architect, the reference French architect, designed the building finally. So this beautiful building, as a matter of fact, concluded a period. And Le Corbusier, at this time, was very disappointed not having been commissioned himself and decided to go to America. And he went for 6 months. He wrote a book that you may have read, which title is When Cathedrals Were White. Beautiful book telling the story of his theory and the failures and the successes. And he went to America for giving 60 lectures, I think, for 6 months, and went back to France completely disappointed because the American did not understand at all his theories. And so he wanted to design something, and he designed this beautiful building in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is the Carpenter Center for Visual Arts. You see this building, which is beautiful. And Louis III, the Spanish architect, was the executive architect in Cambridge. And then another period came, and I'm showing you all these references because I would like you to understand what has founded my own approach to architecture. And this is very influencing to me. And you see those two guys there on the seat, looking at that. It says Mies van der Rohe on the right side and Philip Johnson on the left side. And a lady, and as you know, some of the great stories throughout the world happen because of ladies, most of the time. And Lady Phyllis Lambert, she was the son of Mr. Bronfman, the famous owner of Seagram brand, the alcohol billionaire, an American billionaire. He wanted to build his headquarters in New York, Park Avenue. And he was looking for an architect. And Phyllis Lambert, her daughter, she was an architect, and she was working in the Mies van der Rohe office. So she told her father, take Mies van der Rohe. He is a wonderful architect. He will design something beautiful for you in New York. And Mr. Broswan says, no, I don't know him. He's a German guy coming from, I don't know that guy. And he was acquainted with Philip Johnson, because Philip Johnson was coming from an industrial family of Texas, very wealthy family, and he knew Philip Johnson, and he asked them to associate and design this building. And so in fact, Mies designed this incredible building that, of course, you know, which is one of the most beautiful buildings in New York, Park Avenue, just before Central Station, the Seagram building, designed in the 60s. And I can tell you, to illustrate this first part of my lecture, that if you go to Park Avenue, if you look at this building, you will conclude that this building could have been designed yesterday. And this building is 70 years old. And so when I talk to you about timeless architecture, I mean that. Now, we have seen that we could, of this movement of post-war, and we come to another guy, also very important in my background and very influential of my work, that you may have recognized, Lois Cann. And Lois Cann was coming from Estonia. He was an immigrant to America. He settled in Philadelphia. As he was a Jewish, he has been contented very much by the population in Philadelphia. It took a long time for him to make himself acknowledged, accepted, and recognized as a great architect by the people of Philadelphia. But he reached that goal, and when he designed this incredible piece of architecture in Dallas, Fort Worth, which is the Kimball Museum. And then I have picked this building because there is another dimension of architecture that I would like to talk to you, is light. And a museum is all about light. And you see, it's all concrete, but the fact, the way it is designed introduces light throughout the spaces and make you particularly happy when you get into the Campbell Museum, when you are looking at the paintings. And of course, now we come back to the 14th century, and I've come with Michele Circella from Italy, who is working with me in my office. And Michele, he has been, you may ask a question later if you want to him. He has been a professor of architecture at the Bari University in the south of Italy. And we had in common, before he came to France working with me, we had in common this building. And this building is Castel del Monte in the south of Italy, is the first octagon that has founded generation of culture in architecture, including the office of Frank Lloyd Wright that was based on an octagon, including this Lois Cann building in Dhaka, which is also an octagon, and including, of course, leading on the Kevin Roche work, which was the last building of this period I will show you, which is the Fourth Foundation in New York. The first time I've been in New York, it was in '67. I've been impressed by, when I looked at this building, and I decided to become an architect. And of course, another period started. So, and I was still a student, of course, in architecture. And you may remember the expo in Montreal in '67, where Buckminster Fuller, the German architect, has designed this incredible sphere for the American Pavilion, where Frei Otto designed this incredible tent for the German Pavilion. And a young guy, and the new generation comes up, that means mine at the time, and the new generation comes up, Moshe Safdie, that you see in this picture, came to the expo in '67 with an incredible structure that nobody had seen before, and this was this Habitat 67. And then another period came to the front scene, and of course Le Corbusier was left behind. And I came in because Moshe Safdie and Kevin Roche had convinced me that I could find my happiness in the art of architecture. And I started designing buildings in Paris, first of all in Toulouse, south of France, where I designed the research center for the meteorology, national meteorology. I designed the research center in Paris for the Gaz de France, with this white architecture. And finally, this building, which is the headquarters for the National Public Bank in France, which is 3D building, which has been one of my founding projects at the beginning, with the atrium inside. And then we come to the 80s in France, and you may remember we had in our country an incredible president, Mr. Mitterrand, and Mr. Mitterrand decided that finally the role of a president was to leave behind him major buildings. And he decided to launch international competitions for several buildings. And to start with, he decided to launch a competition for a building to be built in La Défense, named at the time a building for communication. And this was an international competition. Many architects, you may remember, for those that have been on this period, I think that we had 400 entries from throughout the world. And this competition has been won by Johan Otto von Spreckelsen, a Danish architect, and I got the equal first prize. So we had the first debate in between an architecture proposed by Spreckelsen, founded on value, like a link in between the people, like harmony of the shapes, and my architecture that was already proposing an attachment to the communication world and technology of communication at the time. And then the Mitterrand launched a second competition that was the opera for the National Opera for Paris. And I won the first prize for the Opera of Paris with this building. And you have been in Paris likely, and you have maybe attended performances in this building that has been built by a Canadian architect. And then came the project that I won for the Expo in Sevilla. And Sevilla, you may remember the '92 Expo decided to organize a World Expo that was celebrating the 500th anniversary of the discovery of America by Columbus. And it was organized in Seville on the island of La Cartuja, the central island in Seville. And this was an exhibition where 120 countries participated, including Russia. And you remember the times in Russia in '92, so it was a very special period for this country. And this exhibition was very exciting for the architects building there because they had the story of the world just live in front of them. And so we saw all these buildings from the different countries that was reflecting the state of the country at the time. And so I designed this building, which is for the French, the Pavilion for France, with the idea of having a floating roof of 50 meters by 55 meters that would look like as a paper sheet floating in the air, 15 meters high. So I demonstrate by the technology that we could do this performance of having an exhibition hall that was very intriguing in terms of questioning the people by the dimension of architecture. And in fact, this pavilion, where very little things were shown, gathered more than 10 million visitors during the 6 months of exhibition. See? And then I think that the time had came to me after having a little bit around in this project. The time had come to come back to the central city. So I came back to Paris, where they had a competition to design these towers in La Défense, twin towers, and which was a big challenge. It was one of the largest buildings ever built in Europe. It was 200,000 square meters, a big atrium inside. And this building was to be delivered in 2011. You see this building built now, and it proposes, it was to be open on the 13th of September 2011. So it was just 3-4 days after the New York attack, and of course the opening of this building has been cancelled, and this building has been illustrating the end of also a period for architecture. Opening another one, which is this type of studies are made in futuristic ideas, including the idea that we will not in the future build buildings like an office building and then a housing block, but we will build buildings together, and we will try to have housing, hotels, apartments, offices, facilities included in the same building. Okay, so I have built finally 2 towers in La Défense that you see in these beautiful pictures, including the Citroen Park that I've designed a little time, just a few times just after. A park is quite a challenge for an architect, because when you work in architecture, you work with material that you master completely. You can't predict what will be the result of what you do. You design the building, you use materials, and you know about, although there are some surprises sometimes, but you know about what you're going to get in the end. When you design a park, you don't know. You are working with living material, trees, grass, flowers, plants, and they grow, they change in colors, size, appearance, so you don't know what you do. And Citroen Park has been a big lesson of modesty to me. It is one of the most frequented park in Paris. Now some days it gets more than 3,000 to 5,000 visitors. And I've designed next to the park the television building in Paris, which is on the River Seine, just next to the park. And then I thought that time has come to complete my experience in flying a little bit further. So I went to China. So you see how much I was pleased in this picture, because I've been named professor at the University of Shanghai, and I spent several years as a professor there, having beautiful students, and it was quite a nice experience. And I've designed a building in the University of Shanghai that you see here, and I came to the idea that my life as an architect should be a traveling architect. So I start to travel all through the world. So after Shanghai, I went to Chicago to design using this this is a building in the University of Shanghai that you see. So I went to Chicago, and then by chance, or maybe it was a piece of destiny or somewhere, I came back to Mies van der Rohe, because the two towers that you see there are the Lake Shore Drive buildings. That's the two residential towers that Mies designed in the 60s. And these two black steel towers are being, worldwide famous as an illustration of the use of steel in construction, and particularly in this region of the lakes where all the steel mills were located in America. And so I was back to this neighborhood with, you see, the famous John Hancock Tower there by SOM. And then I was proposed to design a building just there. Just there. No, it doesn't work. Just there. This location. Just next to the John Hancock Tower. You see the building. It's a small white triangle, and it's an hotel, in fact. And it has prestigious, of course, neighbors all around. And it was a great adventure for me, having to propose a tower in this location. And Chicago is particularly impressive for architects. There is one of the mentors of the architecture in Chicago, Stanley Tigerman, who says that in New York, towers are too close to each other. In Los Angeles, they are too loose to each other. And in Chicago, they are just right. That means that when you build a tower in Chicago, you can see the tower, but it has a relationship with the other towers, although it is not next to each other, and you can go always around the tower. So when you do something in Chicago, you better not miss your target, because if you miss your project, I can tell you that it shows. And so I designed this building, white, all-glass building, which is a building based on the idea of intersections of volumes. And you see this building now in the end of the street with the Lakeshore Drive buildings just in front of you, and this building that peeps out just in the end of the street. So I made this link that I have all my life dreamed of, is to connect somewhere with Mies van der Rohe in architecture. And so this building had made me known, and we designed, and I designed immediately after a competition, a building Houston, which was illustrating, and that would be my final image, that was illustrating this idea of the theme, the main theme of this lecture, which is the confrontation in between modern architecture and heritage. And here in this picture, you see a beautiful house designed by Atlee Hears in 1952, in 1929, which has been given in 1952 by Mrs. McNay to a foundation for the arts, and it has become one of the most famous museums of modern art in Texas, in the United States. And you see the blue dots on these images shows that during 50 years they were keeping adding new wings, and finally the buildings were looking, you know, as something with no interest at all. So the board of trustees decided to launch a competition, international competition, to pick and to select an architect to design a new temporary exhibition wing for good. And I won this competition with my office, and I designed this building, which was next to the famous listed building, of course, the famous listed house by Atlee Hears. And you see, I came back to very pure modernist lines, and I came back to light, because I think that light is one of the founding elements of architecture. Thank you very much. So if you have questions, take questions.
Если у вас есть вопросы, задавайте, пожалуйста. Мы передадим вам микрофон, но поднимайте руку. Вопросы. Сейчас к вам идут.
Hello. Thank you for the lecture. And could you tell, please, a little bit more about your team, the people you are working with?
Excuse me?
Could you tell, please, about your team, the people you are working with, about the projects?
My teams?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, of course. I have a great team in Paris. I think we have we are a team of about 120 architects in my office. Two of the principals are there. Blin Trinkal, which is just behind you, she's an American. She graduates from Berkeley, and she was in charge of the McNay project that you've seen. This is my Blin. And another one is Michele Cerciala. He's from Italy. He was a professor at Bari University, and he was in charge of the hospital that we have designed in Toulouse and many other projects. And we have a very young and very active. We have, I think, at the office more than 12 or 13 nationalities in Paris, and it's a very exciting time we have in Paris. Was it your question? Or yes? Yes, of course. And of course, as you see, we are working in different places in the world, and but we try to pick up projects that relate more or less to the themes I've told you. For instance, we are working at the moment to the design of a new precinct, a new district in Brussels, the capital of Europe, on the site where the World Expo of '58 was there, the Atomium, the famous Atomium site. And we are designing a new area where we try to implement this idea of the mixed-use architecture, and aggregated architecture, where you find in the same building, like the Corbusier building that I've shown you, you find housing, offices, services, schools integrated in the same structure. And we have won the competition last year, and we will start the final studies this year, and it's going to be one of the major projects in Europe. Yes.
А меня переведут? Что вы думаете о Москве? Как она развивается сейчас?
Yes, because Russian is Next time, I promise I will speak Russian. Okay.
Что вы думаете о Москве, как она развивается сейчас, и как вы думаете, она должна развиваться с вашей точки зрения?
Okay, well, I don't know what I think about Moscow. I am very much excited by this city. I've been coming to Moscow for a long time, including the previous period. I worked for the Vernadsky Institute. I've been designing a project in the 80s on the Place on Gagarin Piazza. And also a new museum. So I know this town I've been knowing this town for a long time. And what I have observed, and for 10 years I didn't come back to Moscow, and now there is an opportunity for me to come again. And I've observed that this city has changed rapidly and for the good. For instance, the works that you have all over the city will very much improve the streetscape of the city. And this was a necessity to change these huge boulevards and avenues with these highways running through the cities through a more landscape environment with trees, curves, pavements for people, and to demonstrate also that this is not, the car is not the only way to circulate in the city. You can walk, you can take a metro, you can take a bus, you can cycle, a bike, you can walk. You have many ways to circulate in the city, and change the overall landscape. Also, the buildings have been nicely refurbished all over the place, and I think what I expect the most in Moscow, and of course we have been observing some kind of international architecture coming back also, particularly in Moscow city, and I think there is a long and highly qualitative tradition of architecture in this country that refers to all movements of modern and ancient architecture, and they are the basis in this country, and particularly in Moscow, to produce a very surprising modern architecture that will make the happiness of the people. And this, I tell you that because I'm not sure that I've seen this type of architecture since yet.
Thank you very much. How do you think, do we have enough light in city downtowns like Manhattan, for example, on the ground level?
I didn't get the questions. I didn't understand the question. I didn't understand the question. Could you repeat the question? Could you trust? Yeah, because the speakers are just in front of me, so I don't hear you. Yeah.
How do you think, do we have enough light in city downtowns like Manhattan, for example, on the ground level?
Asking me about the ground level and about the city, is that right? Well, I think a city, as I told you, in the future, the density of cities will increase. And the reference level that in the city we have at the moment will change drastically. At the moment, we are used in the tradition of the 20th century to consider that there is a ground level, there is an underground, and there is a top of buildings. In the future, and particularly in the project I told you about in Brussels, then you don't know where the reference level is anymore. You see, you walk, for instance, on the terrace and on the roofs of buildings. You have dinner on the 5th story of a building. You can go from different stories of a building to another one. You have a garden which is located on the terrace on the 3rd floor, a public garden. So as we are going to change the basic structure of the reference level because of this increase in density, we are going to create different patterns in terms of city structure. And I invite you to have a look at this project in Brussels. You will see that it brings an answer to your question. The structure of the city of the future will not be what we know today. And of course, Moscow, it's a particular city because you have a lot of land available. This city the structure of the land has been built with a lot of green spaces, open spaces, and the density of the city is not very high compared to other cities throughout the world. But in Brussels, for instance, in Tokyo, for instance, in New York, for instance, in Chicago Center, I showed you, the land is not available anymore. So the architects start by superimposing buildings on top of each other to create different reference levels and structures. So this idea of the ground floor and of the relationship to the floor will change drastically over time.
Я хотел попросить вас резюмировать, по-вашему, каким принципам должно соответствовать здание, чтобы оно было современным и десятки лет спустя? Могли бы вы резюмировать, по вашему мнению?
I have not a simple reply to your question because I can give you some of the parameters that make, to me, a building timeless. For instance, the flexibility of the building. For instance, when I was starting designing buildings in architecture, I was having a special pattern for office block. I was having another one for a housing building. I was having another one for services. And so each of the building had its own way of being designed through architecture and its own paradigm. Today, we don't know anymore. We design an office block, but we want that if this block is left over in 10 years, it can become an hotel, or an hotel can become a residential building, or it can become half an office block and half a residential building. So we are very much interested through the change in architecture and the fact that each building can accommodate several functions over time. So the idea of timeless in this respect is the capacity of architecture and buildings to face different usages over time, or not. And some buildings cannot, of course. And you see them, for instance, abandoned because nobody wants them anymore. And as they have still some value, they are still standing in the city, waiting for a better future. And this future doesn't come because the building has not been designed accordingly. So this idea of flexibility can be a part of the answer to your question. Also, the quality of the building is another part. The fact that some buildings last in terms of they resist to the weather, to the usage, to the people, to the idea, to the fashion also, because they can and some other don't, some other building don't. And this is something also that sometimes you don't know exactly when you start designing a building. If you ask me, when I design a building, am I sure that this building will be timeless? Of course not. I design a building because I think that it is the best answer to a question that have been raised at the moment I am designing the building. And I do my best for this building to be, lasting over time. Also, another dimension that we take into account in all the buildings now is the energy and environmental aspects of the architecture. We want the buildings to save energy. We want the buildings to be adapted to the climate and to the usages. So these are new dimensions that we give to the building, and all these together make that some buildings, of course, last more than the others. And also another parameter that I give you is that 20 years ago, particularly in Paris, when I was starting designing a new building or a new district in Paris, we were starting by demolishing the existing district. We're coming to a new site or to a new neighborhood, and before designing or before building a new project, first thing, demolishing everything. Now, of course, we don't do that anymore, and this is fortunate, very fortunate. We take into account the existing, we keep as much as we can of the existing, we expand the existing, we expand in height, in size, the existing buildings, we reuse and we recycle all the materials and the spaces, so we try to capitalize on the existing construction, and because we value them, we think that if they are in the city, they have a lot of value. So all these factors make things more or less timeless.
Good evening. What is the architectural design process like for your team, and how has it changed over the years with the newer architectural movements?
Some things have changed very much in the design, and some have not. Some have not. The formalization of conceptual design hasn't changed that much. What have changed are the tools we used and to produce the conceptual design. I didn't have time to comment the small models that you see on the screen at the moment, which I call the cool models, very small models that we make at the office to illustrate the conceptual idea of the project at the very beginning. So this time of the conceptual design, where the ideas come and when we start designing the first parts of the building, hasn't changed that much over time. We go faster because we have better tools, but the basic ideas, the basic ways of working have not changed. What have changed drastically are the teams. It's a teamwork. We work with engineers, landscape architects, interior designers. The teams gather to produce from the very beginning a kind of integrated design and at the highest level. And what has changed even more is the production part of the design. Then we have incredible tools, and as you know now, we have the BIM system, the building imaging modeling system, where all the buildings after the concept, right after the conceptual design, are modelized 3D, and we have immediately under our eyes an image 3D of the building. You can manipulate this image, you can get into it, you can have rendered image of it, you can count, measure, you can evaluate the cost of the building from the very beginning. So these computerized and digital tools that we have at the moment have eased very much the phase of the production building. But the conceptual, the ideas come because of this. I try to show you that, in fact, in architecture, you base your ideas upon the grounds that you build over time. It takes a lot of time to know what you think it's good to do in architecture. And this requires a lot of culture and a lot of knowledge about what has been done before you and what matters to you. And so I've shown you as far as I'm concerned. And now that we have stated with a group of architects I'm working with this basis, we go faster.